In today's video, we're going to wrap up Chapter 7, which we started in the last lecture. So last time we talked about our associative structure of instrumental conditioning. We talked about that very narrow approach and our three-term contingency where we considered S, R, and O and all of the possible associations between those three terms. Today, we're going to move away from that, and we're going to talk about the behavioral regulation approach or the response allocation approach. So unlike our narrow associative structure approach, our behavioral regulation approach is a much broader approach. So instead of focusing on the individual elements of each specific response that's being made, now we're going to look at how instrumental conditioning can put limits on an organism's activities and cause redistributions of that behavior among other behavioral response options. So we're taking that step back and looking at the bigger picture here. To get started on this topic, let's actually talk about some history that led to where the field is now. So we're going to focus on some different perspectives and considerations when looking at the nature of reinforcers. So originally we had Thorndike's idea, and Thorndike considered reinforcers as special types of stimuli. So Thorndike specifically characterized reinforcers as stimuli that produced a satisfying state of affairs. So from this perspective, we could say that reinforcers are just special stimuli that strengthen instrumental behaviors. Now on the surface, this lines up with what we have mostly been taught about instrumental conditioning and reinforcers kind of up to this point in our educations in psychology and behavioral learning and stuff like that. But this far into this course, you might come to expect that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Now, the first challenge that came to this idea that reinforcers are just stimuli came from Fred Sheffield and his colleagues, who said that many reinforcers, such as food and water, end up eliciting species-typical unconditioned responses, such as chewing, licking, and swallowing. This observation led to their consummatory response theory, or CRT, which said that these species-typical consummatory responses are critical features of reinforcers. So it's not just stimuli, it's responses as well that are involved in this reinforcing. Now, this assumes that these consummatory behaviors, like chewing and swallowing, are fundamentally different from other instrumental responses, like pressing a lever or running or opening a latch or whatever. And that's because these are part of a natural chain of events. So the completion of these natural biological behavior sequences, the act of eating, would actually itself be the reinforcer. So the food isn't the reinforcer, but eating that food, that behavior, is instead considered our reinforcer. And the primary point of evidence that the textbook focuses on is the fact that saccharin, which is an artificial sweetener, it can be used as a reinforcer even though it has no nutritional value. So it doesn't reduce a drive or biological need, it isn't biologically useful, and yet it can still act as a reinforcer despite having no biological value. So if the food that's being consumed, the saccharin, doesn't actually have any benefit, then maybe it's the act of eating that food that's being reinforcing, that's are considered reinforcing. Now, not everybody agreed with this perspective, and in fact, we're going to spend a lot of time in this lecture talking about one of the biggest disagreeers with the CRT, and this is David Premack. Now, Premack agreed with the idea that reinforcers weren't stimuli, that they were indeed responses, but Premack disagreed with the idea of what the nature of those reinforcer responses were. So Premack said that reinforcer responses would be special only because they are more likely to occur than the instrumental responses. So eating is different from lever pressing simply because eating happens more often and lever pressing happens less often. But the nature of them otherwise isn't really important. So this biological component doesn't matter. It's all about how likely a behavior is to occur. This idea led to the development of the Premack principle, sometimes also called the differential probability principle. And it's called the differential probability principle because we're looking at two different behaviors that have different probabilities of occurring. So the example of eating. Eating is a very likely or high probability event. Rats tend to eat. Any organism is going to tend to eat fairly often, and especially in operant conditioning setups where those organisms are food deprived, then they're going to be very, very likely to eat at any given opportunity. Whereas instrumental responses like pressing a lever or pecking a button or anything like that, those behaviors are much lower probability. And the principle goes on to state that the difference in those response probabilities is what's critical for reinforcement. So if we look at a sort of simply stated version of the Premack principle, the textbook has the fully stated official wording of the law, but I find the symbols work just as well. We have H for a high probability response, L for a low probability response, so H could be eating and L could be lever pressing. We would say that the opportunity to perform a high probability response after a low probability response will reinforce that low probability response. So if after pressing the lever you get to eat, then you are going to be more likely to press the lever. However, if we switch the order around, if we say that the opportunity to perform a low probability of behavior occurs after the opportunity to perform a high probability behavior, then you're not going to see that same reinforcement. Getting to eat does not make you more likely to press the lever. It only works if the low probability event comes first. Now, stating that is all well and good, but how do we actually show that this is the case? How do we show that the Premack principle actually applies to different types of behaviors? So let's look at the standard way of testing the Premack principle. So we have two basic steps. The first is that you want to establish a baseline of responding for different behaviors. You want to figure out which behaviors are high probability and low probability, which behaviors occur fairly frequently on their own, and which ones occur less often. Once you've established that, then you can set up an instrumental conditioning procedure where you present the low probability or the opportunity to perform the low probability behavior first, and then follow it with the opportunity to do the high probability behavior, and then do the opposite, high probability first, then low probability, and see how the performance of those behaviors changes based on the order there. Now, the really important implication here, if this is true, is that any high probability response can serve as a reinforcer for a lower probability response. So even though we've been talking about things like eating being a high probability response, we can have anything that occurs more often than your low probability response. So we can include non-consumatory behaviors as reinforcers. So things like playing a video game or even just getting to sit in a quiet room, something like that could be reinforcing based on this principle. So let's actually look at an example of this. Let's test the Premack principle. So this study is one of Premack's original studies. And we're setting up a situation where a rat in an operant box has access to unlimited water. They would also have access to a running wheel. And for rats really love running. They need water, but if they have unlimited access to it, they don't spend a ton of time drinking. They will, however, spend a ton of time running if given the opportunity. So from our first step where we establish our baseline, we see that drinking is a very low probability event and running is a very high probability event. Now let's go to step 2, which is actually conducting that instrumental conditioning procedure. And we can ask, will a rat run in order to drink? So you can probably predict which way this is going to go, but no. Rats will not do a high probability event to get access to a low probability behavior. They aren't going to run any more or less, even if the amount of water they get to drink or not drink changes when they have unlimited access to water. Now let's see what happens when we reverse it. What if they have to drink water in order to run? What happens if we go low and then high? And as you might predict, we then see that they will drink more if they get to run after drinking. So even if they don't really want to drink because they have unlimited access to water, if drinking water is the only way they get to run, then they're going to drink water. So getting to perform a high probability behavior after performing a low probability behavior reinforces that low probability behavior. Okay, and what about in a situation where we have a water deprived rat? So if we change the environment up, we can actually make drinking water the high probability behavior, and we can make running the low probability behavior. So this isn't something that is specific to drinking behaviors versus running behaviors. This is all about probability, and this is where the Premack principle comes into play, where it isn't anything innate about that particular behavior, it's all about the probabilities. And so in this case, we can start with, will they run to drink water? If the water is the high probability behavior, if this is a low to high situation, then yes, they are going to run to get water. So we see an increase in running if the rats are water deprived. And we don't see an increase in drinking if they have to run to drink. If they have to drink to run. To write this out again, so they will not drink to run, which again makes sense. So we will see an increase in behavior if it's the low to high, but we will not see an increase if it's the high to low. And we can change which behaviors are low and high probability by changing up the environment, by changing up the situation. And so it isn't anything innate to these specific behaviors, it's all about the situation, which is why getting this baseline is so important. So our environment can influence what is high and low probability behavior. We also have issues of individual differences and species differences and stuff like that, which is why you always do step 1, which is get your baseline to establish which behaviors are high and low probability. So let's look at this principle in another situation. So not just rats in operant boxes, let's look at children and sort of semi-natural behaviors. So here we have a group of children, and all of the subjects are given the opportunity to either eat candy or play pinball. This is our baseline stage where they can do both as much as they want, and we want to establish which are the high probability behaviors and which are the low probability behaviors for each individual. So all of these individuals would eat candy more often. So if we wanted to look at candy versus pinball, they would have a higher bar for candy and a lower bar for pinball. And then these individuals on this side, they ate less candy and played more pinball, so their graph would look like this at the start. So we've established our high versus our low probability events for 2 different types of individuals here. So we can separate them out into, should be an H, is pinball high probability or is eating candy high probability? So let's set it up so that they have to play pinball in order to get candy. For the kids that preferred candy over pinball, this is a situation of play pinball, low probability event, in order to eat candy, high probability event. But for the individuals that played more pinball, eating candy is a low probability event, and the playing pinball is actually a high probability event. So from this setup, we can pretty much guess what the graphs are going to look like. If playing pinball allowed the opportunity to do the more preferred behavior or the higher probability behavior of eating candy, then we see an increase in the pinball playing. But if the pinball is the higher probability event, then playing pinball to get to eat candy doesn't really change how much pinball they're playing. That one stays pretty flat. So only the kids who preferred candy showed a reinforcement effect of playing pinball. So we only see an increase in pinball playing for those who preferred eating candy. So I can get rid of my doodles, and then we can, of course, do the opposite, where we would say, okay, you have to eat candy in order to play pinball, and for these situations, we would see the opposite, where for the kids who preferred candy, this would be a high probability event followed by a low probability event, and so we see no change in their candy eating. But for the children who preferred pinball, this is a low probability event followed by a high probability event, and we do see a reinforcing of this low probability event, eating candy. And so the kids who preferred pinball show that reinforcement effect. And it's a really nice experiment here because we see both reinforcing and non-reinforcing in both directions, depending on what is high and low probability for that particular individual. And so there can be tons and tons of applications of this. As we said, the implication of the Premack principle is that any high probability behavior can become a reinforcer for any lower probability behavior. So in a clinical setting, you could find out what behavior is reinforcing, something that has a high probability of occurring, for each individual. And this is especially handy for individuals who don't find the standard reinforcers of, say, food or money directly reinforcing. So the textbook talks about individuals who have schizophrenia, and they don't want to perform a task. For whatever reason, they were supposed to be performing a coil stripping project, which would involve unwinding coils of a particular metal. And they had tried reinforcing them with candy, cigarettes, fruit, cookies, all sorts of potential reinforcers that had no reinforcing effect on this behavior. However, when they set it up so that these individuals, when they actually did that less desirable behavior, that low probability behavior of unwinding those coils, they could then be allowed to sit for a long period of time. They found that that actually ended up increasing the amount of coil unwinding behaviors. And that's because when left to their own devices, these patients had chosen to sit still by themselves. So giving them the chance to do that high probability event of just sitting by themselves ended up reinforcing that low probability event of unwinding coils. So there's tons and tons of different applications for this procedure. Just one more quick example before we move on from this, we can look at stereotyped behaviors in children with autism. So the textbook goes into a little bit more detail on this, but these children were displaying some very highly stereotyped behaviors. Things like repeating words, called echolalia, or persistent manipulation of an object, also called perservative behavior. Those stereotyped behaviors were something that the children did fairly often, so they would be considered highly likely or high probability behaviors. And so in this situation, they're trying to get the children to perform a particular task. So that's why this axis here is correct performance percentage. We're just seeing how much of that task they're going to do based on different reinforcers. So for the child who developed that echolalia, the repetition of words, they were reinforced with either the ability to repeat those words that they wanted to repeat for a window of time, or they were given a food reward. And from the graph here, we can see that the food reward, these open squares, was pretty much the same, no different from baseline. But when they were reinforced with that ability to repeat their word, then the percentage, or the correct performance percentage, rose above baseline. So we see an increase in that low probability behavior of correctly performing the task when then allowed to engage in a high probability behavior. And we see the same pattern in the second graph here with preservative behavior. So we can see that our individual preferred behavior was a better reinforcer than a food reinforcer. And this supports the idea that reinforcers are responses or behaviors and not just stimuli. And I've already stated these, so reinforcers are responses, not stimuli, is our take-home, our first take-home from the PREMAC principle. And the second is that this principle gives us an expanded range of activities that could be used as reinforcers. We're not restricted to food and water and things that are biologically relevant. We can use any high probability event as a reinforcer, which is pretty great. Now, our next theory is going to come from Timberlake and Allison, who formulated the response deprivation hypothesis, sometimes called the disequilibrium model. Now, they argued that restricting the reinforcer is the most critical factor for instrumental reinforcement. And this kind of makes sense because we've seen that a full rat will not perform an operant response to get food. They have no desire for food because they're already full. So this deprivation is very, very important in this instrumental reinforcement process. And they noted that most instrumental setups involve deprivation of some kind. If your reinforcer is food, then the organism is usually food deprived. If the reinforcer is water, then they're usually water deprived. So there's sort of this built-in idea of deprivation being important. But this hypothesis or this theory made this the critical, most important point of the whole setup. Now, PREMAC realized that restricting access was important, as we saw in that original study where we looked at rats' performance with and without free access to water, but this idea of restriction wasn't central to the PREMAC principle. It wasn't rolled into the theory at all, so it wasn't as important as we're stating here. For our response deprivation hypothesis, we're saying that this behavior is reinforcing because of the restriction that's imposed, not because of the probability of the response. So the restriction is the key factor here. So if we want to sort of expand on that and look at what it really means in the real world, we're saying that a low probability response can reinforce higher probability responses if that low probability behavior is restricted to below baseline levels. If there's some kind of restriction to that response, then it can serve as a reinforcer to what would usually be considered a higher probability response. And the implications of this is that any behavior can be reinforcing if we restrict access to that behavior sufficiently. And so we can come back to this PREMAC experiment where we had unlimited water and then a water-deprived scenario. And we could look at this saying that water is reinforcing here specifically because it was restricted. So when water was not limited, water was not a reinforcer. But if we restrict that access to water, we can make water reinforcing, and a naturally lower probability activity like drinking can come to reinforce what's usually a high probability behavior like running because of that restriction. All right, so now that we've covered the baseline, let's start putting stuff together. Our Premack principle and the response deprivation hypothesis were both essential precursors to the response allocation approach, or the behavioral regulation approach. This response allocation approach considers reinforcement and instrumental conditioning from a broader perspective. So we just keep taking steps back and back to look at more and more factors that need to be considered within our instrumental conditioning setup. So now, instead of just focusing on the instrumental and reinforcer responses, this response allocation approach is going to consider the broad range of activities that are always available to an individual. So we have this assumption that all individuals have a preferred distribution of activities. So even though we were looking at a rat in an operant box who could drink water or run on a running wheel, there are so many other things that rat could be doing. They could be sleeping or sitting still or digging in the corner or whatever. There's a full distribution of activities that should also be considered. So we're still going to want to consider our baseline distribution of activities. What are we going to do when left to our own devices? So what does the rat do when given free rein of the cage with access to whatever they need access to, food, water, running wheel, whatever? How are they going to behave when there are no restrictions? Then we're going to use our behavioral regulation to focus on how our response reinforcer contingencies force individuals away from that baseline distribution. So these response reinforcer contingencies are the experimental procedures that we put into place. So if we say that a rat has to drink water in order to run on the running wheel, that is a response reinforcer contingency that we have put into place. And so this process, we're going to look at how our behaviors shift when we're being forced away from our baseline distribution. And this is going to sound very familiar to the principle of homeostasis, sort of that natural equilibrium at which your body exists, and then some force will push you away from that equilibrium and you're trying to find a new balance. That's basically what we're going to be looking at here with behavioral regulation. Now that baseline is also sometimes called a bliss point, which is going to become very important in the next little bit. So to look at our behavioral regulation and see how our contingencies are forcing animals away from their natural distribution, as you can imagine, you want to start with step 1 is establishing a baseline. Measure the behaviors that are performed when no constraints exist. This unrestricted baseline of behaviors is what we can call our behavioral bliss point. And after we've established that bliss point, we can then place our constraints on the behavioral allocation. We can put into place our rules of the likelihood of a reinforcer occurring because of a particular response. We impose that instrumental contingency, and then we see how the behavior distribution changes. So this diagram comes from a study by Slater and Wood, where they were monitoring zebra finches and seeing what their behavioral bliss point was. So over time, how much of each of these different behaviors did they observe? How much were they resting? How much were they eating? How much were they singing? And how much were they grooming? And so they can score all of those different behaviors and see what their natural bliss point, what their natural behaviors were in order to set that baseline. So step 2 then is that placing of constraints on our behavioral allocation. And as you might imagine, putting these rules into place is going to put pressure on your behavioral bliss point. So an individual is going to want to get back to their desired sort of distribution of events. They're going to act to defend against these challenges to their natural state. But the requirements of your contingency might make it impossible to achieve that behavioral bliss point. and you might have to redistribute your responses to try and stay as close to your desired distribution of behaviors as possible, even though you can't achieve your desired distribution. So even though you can't get exactly to your bliss point, you want to get as close as possible. Now, these are some kind of abstract ideas, and they will start making more sense as we can start seeing some examples on the following slides. So if it hasn't immediately clicked for you yet, don't worry, we're going to keep talking about this. All right, so let's look at a graph that's going to help illustrate this idea of bliss points and imposed contingencies and all of this. So on this graph here, we have the time watching TV and the time spent studying. So we have a student, and we say that when left to their own devices, how much TV do they watch and how much time do they spend studying? And from this bliss point, we can say that the student will spend about 15 minutes studying for every 60 minutes that they watch TV. Or they'll watch TV for 60 minutes for every 15 minutes that they spend studying. We don't necessarily have a cause and effect relationship here. This is just the distribution of behaviors. So while we were observing them, for about every 60 minutes watching TV, they spend about 15 minutes studying. However, we can then move on and establish our imposed contingency. Maybe we have a schedule of reinforcement, and now we say that in order to watch 15 minutes of TV, they have to study for at least, looks like 14 minutes or 13 minutes. So we're saying that they have to watch or have to study this much in order to watch that much TV. So our new rule makes it impossible for them to study for 15 minutes and watch TV for 60 minutes. So how does their behavior change with our new rule put in place? The most common theory that we'll use to determine this is the minimum deviation model. So Stadden put together a model that says that an organism will redistribute their behavior to minimize the deviations of the two behaviors from the bliss point. Basically, along this line, how close can they get to their desired distribution of behaviors? How close can they get to the bliss point following the restrictions that we've put in place? So in practice, that means what is the shortest distance from our bliss point to the line? So this is a much longer line than this, and this is another longer line. So our shortest line that we can draw connects with our restrictions at this point. So that tells us that according to this minimum deviation model, this is the point where the organism should redistribute their behaviors. This is how we minimize the deviation of the two behaviors from the bliss point. So studying for 35 minutes and getting to watch TV for 35 minutes is as close as they can get to their bliss point. So this is what we should observe once they have adjusted their behavior to accommodate our restrictions. You can actually use this idea of bliss point as an approach for behavior therapy. If you're trying to change someone's behavior, you can use bliss point and this theory to figure out how you can adjust their behavior. So we can look at an example where we have we're going to use parental reinforcement of pro-social behaviors in children. Basically, we want to increase helping behavior in children. So we want to make them more likely to help out, to share, basically do good behaviors. And we're going to use parental reinforcement as the motivator or the reinforcer for that behavior. Now, this example comes straight from the textbook, and it helps to show how the theory of this bliss point and the distribution of behaviors can actually help explain situations that don't necessarily make logical sense when we consider these situations just by looking at reinforcers. In establishing our baseline, or our bliss point, when children are left to their own devices, they'd rather do very little helping behavior, and they'd rather get a lot of parental social reinforcement. So they'd like to get a lot of attention and praise from their parents without having to do a whole lot of behavior, good behavior to get it. So our bliss point is at the far left-hand side of the screen here. Now, prior to therapeutic intervention, the parents had employed a 2-to-1 rule for providing reinforcement. So for every 2 positive behaviors that the child did, the parents would only reinforce once. Now, with this restriction in place, we saw an equilibrium value, this point where our positive behaviors and social reinforcements were equally distant from this bliss point, right around 30 positive behaviors and 15 social reinforcers. And that situation was okay, but the parents wanted to see if they could make it better. Could they make their child do more positive social behavior? And so to try and increase the amount of positive behaviors they saw in their child, they decided to increase their rate of reinforcement. So they switched over to a 1-to-1 rate of reinforcement. So every behavior that the child did, every good behavior, the parents would reinforce with their social interaction. And from our new equilibrium point along this new restriction here, we actually see that the children ended up settling at a point of less positive behavior. So they were doing only about 22 positive behaviors and were getting 22 social reinforcers as a result. So even though the parents had assumed that providing more reinforcement would make that positive behavior more likely to occur, it ended up having the opposite effect. And this can only be explained using our bliss point theory and by actually looking at the data kind of like this to see why we might see that decrease in positive behavior even though the reinforcement had increased. So even though in that example they had expected to see an increase in performance of those positive social behaviors, they didn't end up seeing that. So there wasn't a reinforcement effect. But if we think about our example before that, when we were looking at spending more time studying versus watching TV, this diagram here, with our bliss point, the student would only spend 15 minutes studying. But after employing our restrictions, this new equilibrium value left them studying for 33 minutes at a time. So we see an increase in the behavior that we wanted to increase. So we could say that that showed a reinforcement effect. It showed an increase in the performance of the instrumental response from our baseline responding. And this increase came from the behavioral regulatory mechanisms that are functioning behind the scenes to minimize our deviations from that bliss point. So the 2 examples that we've seen show that depending on how the situation is set up, you can see this increase, this reinforcement effect, showing that increase in that behavior you're looking to increase, but sometimes it can backfire if you're not taking everything into consideration. And towards the end here, we're going to start getting into the idea of behavioral economics. And this is going to come from the fact that, again, there can be many other behaviors that an individual can engage in. So we were only looking at 2 at a time, but we can have multiple other activities. So even in our example of the zebra finches, we saw 4 distinctive activities that could be occurring all at once. And if you looked and monitored other behaviors, I'm sure you could find others. So these other behaviors could be alternate sources of reinforcing. So even if you have a restriction on watching TV, where unless you study, you can't watch TV, well, maybe you still have access to your computer. Maybe you still have access to your cell phone. You could do something else instead of watching TV, and so you wouldn't necessarily increase your studying because watching TV isn't the only source of reinforcement. So let's delve into that just a little bit more and talk about behavior economics. So a lot of the principles and ideas and concepts that relate to adjusting behaviors using what we've talked about end up paralleling economic principles very, very well. And so we can apply these economic principles to the problem of response allocation. So we can look at what alternative sources of reinforcement are available. If we're restricting TV watching, what could you do instead? We can also ask, how do these reinforcers relate to the one involved in the instrumental contingency? Is there another behavior that you could do instead? Is there another behavior that you would usually do at the same time as? How do they all work together? And we can also look at the cost of performing those alternative behaviors. What's the extra restrictions that might exist on performing those behaviors? So again, let's break these down a little bit. And when we think about economics, we're going to be thinking about consumers and supply and demand and costs, but they're all going to relate to the behavioral concepts that we've been talking about so far. So the first thing we're going to talk about is consumer demand, and we're going to see that represented in a demand curve. So on the side here, we have a graph with price along the bottom and the amount of that item that we would then purchase. So if we're looking at how much chocolate would you buy based on the price? So as the price goes up, how does the amount that you would purchase change? And this change in price based on, the change in amount based on price would be called the elasticity of demand. So more formally, we can say that elasticity is the degree to which price influences consumption of a commodity. So we can look at curve A, where there's a dramatic drop-off in how much of A we purchase based on the price. So this particular commodity is easily affected by the price. So our demand is easily reduced when the cost goes up. So this could be something like candy. If candy is $1, then you're going to buy quite a lot of it. But if it's $10, then maybe you're going to buy a lot less. And then we can see the other extreme where we have C, where demand is least affected by price. So this line stays fairly stable, and there is a slow decline in the amount that you purchase, but it takes a lot of price increase to start seeing a big drop-off in the consumption of that particular product. So this demand is very little affected by price. And we can apply this idea of economics and demand and elasticity to our instrumental responding. So we can look at an example where individuals who are smokers who would be working in order to receive some kind of reinforcement. And so in this study, these individuals had to theoretically pay a certain amount in order to take a puff of a cigarette. And we had two types of smokers, individuals who had abstained from smoking before the experiment and those who did not. So our open circles are the ones who hadn't smoked prior to the experiment. The filled-in circles were the ones who smoked whenever they wanted right before the experiment. And we can see that the individuals who had abstained were willing to pay more to smoke. And they ended up smoking more in those sessions and paid higher and higher prices to continue smoking than did those who had smoked previously. So by manipulating the situation, by making these commodities more desirable, we can see a difference in our demand curve here. And there's another example using cigarette smoking on page 206 of the textbook where we can look at different prices how paying for, oh man, I'm having trouble with words today, where you could see how earning money versus getting to smoke cigarettes they would pay more and more in terms of effort to receive those, and you can look at the demand curves for those. But the textbook does a great job explaining that one, so I chose a different example for here. But our take home here is that we have more demand for those who had abstained, and they were willing to pay more overall and showed less of a drop. Cool. So what actually determines demand? The first of these things is the availability of substitutes. If there are other reinforcers or other commodities available, then it can affect how much you are willing to pay for that commodity. So if we were looking at cigarette smokers and cigarettes were the only opportunity for them to get their nicotine fix, then they would pay much higher prices. But if you also offered maybe access to vapes or nicotine patches, then maybe you'd see a drop in that demand curve where they wouldn't pay as much for cigarettes because other options were available. We also want to consider the price range. So how much does it cost to begin with? An increase in price has very little effect when the cost of the item is low to begin with. So a 10% increase in the cost of something that's only 10 cents would bring it up to 11 cents. 10 versus 11 cents doesn't matter at all. But if it's a difference between $1,000 and $1,100, $1,100, then that's a much bigger difference, and that could influence demand a lot more. So as the cost gets higher, the adjustment of price becomes more and more important. The income or the resources available to the individual can also have an effect on demand. So if you have a higher income or more resources available to you, then high prices are going to affect consumption less and less. So if you have to pay $10 versus $20, if you make $100 a day, then that's not a huge difference. But if you only make $20 a day, that's a massive difference. In terms of behaviors, if the resource is energy, if pushing the lever takes all of your strength, having to push the lever once versus twice is going to take a lot, or it's going to make a big difference. But if it's really easy to press that lever, if you have lots of energy to press it and it doesn't use up all of your energy, then pressing it once versus twice doesn't matter. We can also look at any links with complementary commodities. So if there's a link between a reinforcer and a complementary commodity, then we might be more resistant to changes in prices. So think of the example of hot dogs and hot dog buns. If you're going to have hot dogs, then you're also going to want hot dog buns. Even if the price of hot dog buns go up, because you already have hot dogs or because you want hot dogs, you're going to pay a little bit more for the buns because you want them both together. You can think about this in terms of sort of operant conditioning experiments. If you have, say, rats, if rats have access to dry food, the more dry food they consume, the more they're willing to spend to get water to go along with it. So these complementary commodities can also influence what we're willing to pay. And so for our take home from our messages today, we can say that behavior is reinforced by the opportunity to engage in other, more desirable behaviors. We can gauge this thing of desirability by noting the baseline activity levels before we impose restrictions. And we can create a reinforcer by restricting access to it. We can reorganize our behavior. We can manufacture demand by restricting access. And these procedures or these ideas apply across multiple topics that we talked about today, which is kind of cool. So it's a really good take-home message here. And we're going to end off talking about just some things to consider when we're looking at rewards or reinforcers. We're using the title "Are Rewards Bad?" because that's what was associated with this when it was published. But we tend to use reinforcers a little bit more often because it's more correct. But things to consider: whenever possible, use intangible rewards. Don't provide a toy if a compliment will do. It's the same as saying use a conditioned reinforcer rather than a natural reinforcer. You can become full on food, or you can have too many toys, but a compliment or being told you've done a good job, you're not going to run out of those or run out of space for those. For second, we can avoid using rewards as incentives. Instead of saying, if you do X, I'll give you Y, if you wait for the behavior to occur and then provide the reward without having promised it, it can go better. So this would be like letting the organism figure it out itself instead of providing explicit instructions. But for whatever reason, this seems to work better when things are set up this way. Rewarding at a high rate in early stages of learning and then gradually reducing the frequency of rewards as learning progresses is another good course of action. So start off with continuous reinforcement and then move to intermittent reinforcement, like we've talked about previously. Reward only behavior that you want repeated. If you don't want your child to whine and complain, don't provide rewards to quiet her when she whines and complains. So reinforce the desired behaviors and don't reinforce undesirable behaviors. Makes sense? Remember that what is an effective reward for one person might not be an effective reward for another person. So some people are intrinsically motivated, some people are extrinsically motivated. Different people have different preferences. As we saw with our establishing baselines, you want to figure out what works for each individual. Reward success and set standards so that success is achievable. So reinforce good behaviors, but make sure that it's actually possible to do those behaviors. If you're trying to get yourself to do a particular thing, if you don't set reasonable goals, then you're going to just become discouraged. So if you're trying to eat healthier, you don't want to say that step 1 is going to be never ever eat unhealthy food ever again, because that's a really big jump. You'd be a lot better off saying, okay, I'm going to reduce my consumption of junk food. And then next week, once that's been a little bit easier, maybe I'll reduce sugary beverages, and then I'll try and reduce something else. So baby steps are going to be a lot more effective to obtain sort of more difficult goals. We want to bring attention to intrinsic rewards for the activity itself that the activity itself offers. So instead of focusing on just getting something externally, like if you do this thing, you get a cookie, talk about how fun it is. Talk about something intrinsically motivating about that behavior, and that'll end up being better in the long run, especially if you're not always going to be there to provide a physical reinforcer. So these are some good points as a takeaway for using reinforcement or rewards in real life. And we've already seen this slide. I don't know why I have it in here twice, but this is just a reminder of what we covered in this chapter, where we looked at associative structures of instrumental conditioning, the ideas of Thorndike, Pavlov, and that narrow approach with our 3-term contingency. And then we took a step back and looked at behavioral regulation, some links to Skinner, but also specifically talking about Thorndike again and how he wasn't quite right, moving into our CRT and then the Premack principle, and then onward again into our more broad approaches, and eventually culminating in our economics approach. So lots of stuff covered this time around, but all kind of tying together principles that we've talked about previously. So a really cool chapter.